It is a given to talk about this topic. Without these wars, Europe's foundation would be the crumbling feudalism of the Middle Ages. The idea, let alone the birth of nationalism, would be postponed if the corporal did not let his ambition try to conquer vast swaths of the European heartland. The great men of Europe could never create that binding peace that'd last a century if these wars didn't happen. So let's talk about it. We begin quite humbly in the island of Corsica. This place switched many hands, but Genoa had the main presence here. But then they declared independence, and Genoa wouldn't bother to deal with it. So they did the sensible thing and sold it to France. This is central to our story, as Napoleon was born on this island. The French influence was strong there, but Napoleon respected his Corsican roots, often opposing it. I clearly say that Napoleon took the most advantage of the French Revolution, feeding his ambition with the tenets of equality, liberty, and fraternity that came fresh. But he wasn't a fan of the terror and executions. He didn't believe in such harshness in revolution. Really, he wanted to make sure that France left giving positions to nobility solely, and instead of issuing a meritocracy, giving those with talent, regardless of upbringing, to rise the ranks. What made him act and actually rise the ranks was his volunteering in the military, mainly in the siege of Toulon and other fronts. Quick context, France was embroiled in war, as after the removal of the monarchy, other European powers formed a coalition to militarily subdue them and restore order, but the corporal would prove to be their greatest enemy in a few years. France was a mess at this time. The revolution had put the country in a very dangerous spot. The monarchies of Europe feared for their heads and decided that pacifying France was paramount to avoiding total chaos. And so, they abandoned a coalition to execute their plan. But here's where Napoleon comes into the frame. After his minor involvement in putting down royalist revolts and skirmishes in other towns, he eventually was given command of the armies of the Italian front. Unlike the two great armies that fought on the front lines, these armies that Napoleon commanded were heavily demoralized and undersupplied. But here's where Napoleon came into the frame. His rousing speeches and charisma facilitated loyalty between the men, and they set out anew to fight for France. Let's picture this. The French army under Napoleon was facing the joint Sardinian-Austrian army, and Napoleon knew exactly how to win. He divided his forces to separately deal with each army. After a string of victories, he kicked Sardinia out of the war and pushed so close to Vienna that the Austrians sued for peace. Napoleon was hailed a hero, but the jealous government decided he ought not to stay anymore, so they equipped him with a side quest, invading Egypt. He set out and took a sizable chunk, but after landing, his fleet was wrecked by British Admiral Nelson, and an Anglo-Ottoman force beat him at Acre. So Napoleon left his men and bailed for France. Now back in the frame of politics, Napoleon decided to stage a coup against the government, and with the help of his tenanciers, he basically made the government hide in a castle to do a Jacobin plot to overthrow them. Napoleon's revolution helped him to regain control and forced the ex-government to sign a constitution. A three-consul system was set up, but Napoleon as first consul really had all the power. But before Napoleon took control, the great powers decided it was time for round two, and with Russia on their side, things at first seemed great, until Napoleon served them retribution by blasting right back. In 1800, Napoleon did the crazy thing of crossing the Alps to relieve a besieged force in Genoa. I swear, everything connects to Hannibal and the Napoleonic Wars, doesn't it? In the famous Battle of Marengo, at first the Austrians beat them, but surprised as Napoleon's hit back and clobbered them. With General Moreau's victory at Hohenlinden, Vienna was left bare and Austria sued for peace again. Britain, who was still at war with France, blockaded French ports, but then the neutral countries embargoed them, so they left. And here we have it, Europe at peace. Napoleon's meteoric rise had made him achieve everything, from power to victories to peace. You'd think he's unstoppable, but this is just the surface. Military victories are one thing, but can a country survive with a damaged economy and weak governments? Napoleon answered this question by taking a shot at governing. He did wonders to the economy, creating a national bank, instituting tax reforms, and improving welfare systems. He fixed the civil laws, wrapping up all the scattered laws and codifying. And say goodbye to corruption, bad infrastructure, and women's rights? Yes. Even though the revolution had promised equality, Napoleon let men have more legal power and had full control over their wives legally. Also, Napoleon improved education, achieving a dream of meritocracy in education and choosing talent over nobility. Also, Napoleon struck a deal with the Pope to restore the Church, doing so in 1802. Freedom of religion was instituted, but it was really due to a saying of his. Religion. It is a tool to avoid the rich from being devoured by the poor. Napoleon believed that stability was the key, so he decided that the only thing left for him to do is to wear the purple. He decided to become emperor. In 1804, in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame, Napoleon was witnessed by an esteemed crowd, with even the Pope attending. Traditionally, he'd crown, but Napoleon decided to avoid the circular power division and crown himself in this historic moment. I have to admit, this was Napoleon at his prime. The nations yet again decided to fight France and gathered to win this time. But here's the secret behind both Napoleon and the Allied forces. The Allied forces were not united, so they didn't have the combined power to crush Napoleon. And Napoleon had made an ingenious system where he divided his troops into small corps, which were small armies in themselves. And they lived off the land, so they were lightning fast. In this coalition, he encircled Austrian General Mack and defeated him at the Battle of Ulm, where he proclaimed, "I have destroyed the Austrians," by simply marching. Next, he moved to the Russian army, but it simply ran away. Just remember the tactic of running away. It'll be a reason as to why Napoleon lost in the end. At the Battle of Austerlitz, the Russians were deceived by Napoleon's weak-looking right flank, but they were shocked to see that the French then encircled them, thanks to a fog that set in. Austria sued for peace, yet again, and with the conquest of Naples, this coalition drew to a close. To mention extra details, Napoleon gave positions to his close circle and also had influence in the German states. With that, Austrian Emperor Francis II dissolved the 1,000-year Holy Roman Empire. Spain had allied earlier in 1804, and a combined Franco-Spanish fleet engaged the British at Trafalgar. In the ensuing naval battle, British Admiral Nelson did the unthinkable and pushed into the fleet, unleashing hell. Nelson would be killed in action, but he became a legend. This battle would also sour the relations between Spain and France. Prussia actually joined later, beginning the War of the Fourth Coalition, but the Prussian King Frederick William III wasn't as bright and lost the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. After pushing into Berlin and Prussia proper, Napoleon engaged the Russians in a brutal winter combat, and in the Battle of Eylau, almost lost if it weren't for his flamboyant cavalry general Murat. In the Battle of Friedland, Russian General Benningsen made the mistake of having the Aller River to his back, being pinned down by the French artillery. After the Battle of Friedland, Russian Tsar Alexander I made peace with Napoleon. The meeting was quite warm, with them meeting on the raft, sharing gifts, laughing, chatting, and even kissed at one point. Embarrassing. This peace would make Russia join France against the UK, invade Sweden, and bully Prussia into losing a bunch of land. Really, only the UK remained as their major enemy, and they were bothersome with their navy. So Napoleon issued the Continental System, where no one would trade with Britain, so its economy would be in ruin. What Napoleon failed to realize is that the British had colonies. They came back real quick, but Europe began to suffer without British goods. Portugal, a classic British ally, was invaded due to refusing to join the system. Napoleon's allies seem more like hitting enemies now, with Spain's Marne being overthrown by his son, and Napoleon mediating, a nice way of saying that he staged a coup in Spain and placed his brother Joseph instead. And thus, the Peninsular War happened as the Spaniards and Portuguese were livid at the idea of being ruled by a power that had disrespected the church and imposed their rule. Austria, ever naive, decided to try one more time, and they failed, being beaten in 4 months. But Napoleon's armies began to dull, and the cracks began to show. He had his first major defeat, the Aspern-Essling, and the Battle of Wagram was a costly victory. Napoleon negotiated peace, and actually married Francis's daughter, so Napoleon would have an heir, which they did. Ignoring Spain, most of Europe was under French influence. Even Sweden replaced her king with one of Napoleon's marshals, Bernadotte, who took the name Karl Johan and became Prince of Sweden, then later king. But something fell wrong. And it was wrong. Here we see Napoleon's fatal mistake. When Russia began to cheat on the alliance and trade with the British, he made the decision to come there and settle the affairs. Napoleon gathered over 600,000 men in the so-called Grande Armée and set out to invade Russia. But the Russians retreated, burning the land behind them, and so Napoleon was forced to use supply trains, being slowed down. Also, the heat of the devilish summer made things harder, but they pushed. Then, at the gates of Moscow, they met for the deadliest battle, the Battle of Borodino. The Russians fought well, but Napoleon's tactics were dulling, and his tactics more and more like suicide frontal assault, leading to a heavy death toll. Moscow was left bare, but the Russians planned this. The generals rushed inside the prisons, freeing arsonists and telling them to burn Moscow to the ground. After a month of unresponded messages, Napoleon realized that they were doomed, so they decided to turn back. But winter set in, and the way back was hell on earth. Men froze, horses and those sick died, and were left as they couldn't be carried, and also the Cossacks ravaged the already exhausted French. Then Napoleon abandoned the men due to plots forming, and the rest crawled up barely alive. Verdict: this invasion was a disaster. Europe seized from Napoleon's control. Austria declared neutrality, while Sweden joined the Allies due to Pomerania's invasion. Also, the UK bought them this war, and they pushed to smash Napoleon into pieces. Napoleon freaked out and called 100,000 conscripts to fight. During some fights, the Allies paused for a second, but they resumed after Austria joined the boys in fighting Napoleon. But here's a new strategy. Whomever Napoleon wanted to fight would retreat, and thus they found a dirty secret to Napoleon's weak point. Eventually Napoleon was cornered in Leipzig, and here we have the Battle of Leipzig, the bloodiest battle of these wars. The French were surrounded on all fronts by Austrians, Swedes, Russians, and Prussians, and even some Saxon soldiers of the French switched sides. Eventually, the French had to flee as they were pushed inside the city, so they crossed a bridge to get out, but miscommunication caused the bridge to prematurely explode, with many dying or being captured. And so the dominoes fell. Spain was liberated, Austria pushed into Italy, Murat rebelled, German states were liberated, Denmark was invaded, etc. But Napoleon kept fighting. He levied conscripts, and in a famous 6 days campaign fought both General Blücher, Prussia, and Schwarzenberg of Austria, but he couldn't keep fighting, and so he was defeated. The leaders of Europe hailed heroes, and Napoleon abdicated as his army was gone. You thought this story was over, huh? Well, it isn't. After the Sixth Coalition, it was decided that Louis XVIII, Louis XVI's brother, would rule. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, where he'd still keep his title and would basically rule Elba. But Napoleon was homesick, so he decided to return. And he did. Even though Louis XVIII sent armies to capture him, they were Napoleon's old men, and they dropped their arms, cheering him on as emperor. His return had mixed reactions, but when the men of Europe heard this, it was the final straw. Even though Napoleon pleaded to be a good boy, they still declared war. But actually, they declared war on Napoleon himself, not France. So the Seventh Coalition came. The biggest threat was Wellington and Blücher's army in Flanders. So Napoleon set out. He fought them, but then they retreated. But the armies did so northward, being in columns with each other, and the French caught the British at defensive positions in Waterloo. The last battle. The British held the high ground, as the French assaulted the Hougoumont farm westward, but the British held the defenses. They lost the farm in their center, and the French unleashed the artillery. But at this pivotal moment, the Prussians arrived. They came earlier, and now in larger numbers. The British hit the Imperial Guard, and the forces, fearing encirclement, fled. It was an Allied victory. Napoleon would be exiled to St. Helena, an island far away in Africa. He would be monitored by a British force and 2 ships. Napoleon had his last battle, the battle to be remembered, and he won so by writing it down in his memoirs. His influence would lead to the Concert of Europe and almost 100-year peace that the great of Europe had said. But his revolutionary ideals would influence revolutions and the creation of countries like Italy and Germany. He remains a top general of the modern age, but he was enigmatic. Did he support the revolution, or betray it with the crown? Was he fighting for ego, or to save Europe from tyrants? Napoleon passed away at the age of 51, officially due to stomach cancer, but some suspect poisoning. The British buried him in an extravagant coffin and sent his body to the Dôme Les Invalides. One of his quotes reads, "There is no immortality, but the memory that is left in the minds of men. To have lived without glory, without leaving a trace of existence, is not to have lived at all." And just one thing, he wasn't short. Anyways, thanks for watching. Goodbye.